Well, I want to thank Bill Farr for that far too lengthy introduction. Crying out loud, Bill, it's a football game at 1:30 this afternoon. And I'd like to thank the Center for the Study of the Rocky Mountain West and the Lewis and Clark Travelers Rest Chapter and the Fort Missoula Historical Museum and all the sponsors of this conference except the Montana Committee for the Humanities, who put that god-awful, outdated picture of me in your program. I'm trying to run for office, and I don't... Would you buy a used car or vote for this person? I have an updated photo which I will deliver to them. Too late. Well, ladies and gentlemen, after the provocative assertions that you've heard in many of the previous presentations, mine is much more traditional and literally down to earth. However, I have strong opinions about everything that has been said at this conference so far, and if you'd like the truth of the matter, well, I will respond to questions afterwards. We begin with the assertion that Lewis and Clark were lost. There's no other word for it. Here they were pushing up the Missouri River from the Great Falls, alarmed that the river seemed to be flowing from the east of south, and frantically looking for some Native Americans to tell them where they were. They were off of the plains but not yet into the mountains, heading south when they should have been heading west, poking around late in the traveling season east of the Rockies when they'd figured to be on the great river of the West, and maybe angry with each other. This was the "where the hell are we" phase of the journey to the Pacific, as Arlen Large calls it. And Large believes that he can read an argument of falling out between the carefully crafted lines of the journals of Lewis and Clark. How did the expedition, whose leaders were already possessed of more geographic information about the Rocky Mountain West than any other white men in America, find itself in so precarious a situation? Why did the success of the expedition, which Meriwether Lewis was wont to compare with his own life, seem in doubt? Now, at the last American Encounters Conference in Lincoln, Nebraska in April, I persuaded myself, if not the members of the audience, that the success of the expedition in its leaders' minds rested on encountering the Shoshone Indians at or near the Great Falls in the early summer of 1805. Lewis and Clark had every reason to believe that the Shoshone would be there, based on their briefings by the Hidatsa at Fort Mandan the previous winter. The captains needed the Shoshone to sell them horses and show them the way across what they still believed would be a relatively short and easy passage through the Rockies. But the Shoshone weren't there, weren't where they were supposed to be. And now here were Lewis and Clark poling on up the Missouri, going in the wrong direction, increasingly nervous, increasingly anxious. And the Shoshone would surely have cautioned the explorers against pushing too far upriver, since the exits to the west were nearby, at the Sun, the Dearborn, the Prickly Pear, at most, the Jefferson. Now, they were following one of President Thomas Jefferson's contradictory instructions to trace the Missouri River to the source, unaware that it conflicted with the other charge to find the most direct and practicable communication across the continent. Now, the expedition's travails and uncertainties continued. It soon reached the Three Forks, an essential point in the geography of this western part of the continent, but still no Shoshone. William Clark became sick and bilious, revealed to Meriwether Lewis that he had not had a passage for 4 days. Lewis prescribed 5 of Dr. Rush's bilious pills, a powerful diuretic known as Rush's Thunderbolts, and Clark was up and about the next day. The explorers continued their scenic detour. They took the tourist route through Montana, up the Jefferson and Beaverhead rivers, but the Indians were elsewhere. Desperate, Lewis forged ahead with 3 men, determined to find the Shoshone if it should cause me a trip of 1 month. But the Shoshone were not in America. They were on the foreign side of the Continental Divide. Lewis found them on the Lemhi River in Idaho, but not before what I've always argued is the most dramatic and symbolic single moment in the entire history of the expedition: Lewis's confrontation with the Rocky Mountain West. Imagine this exquisite scene. Here is Meriwether Lewis hiking resolutely up the east slope of the Bitterroot Mountains, headed for what we now call Lemhi Pass on the Continental Divide. Imagine his thoughts. He cannot have had too many illusions remaining about the West, but there must have been the faintest hope, the tiniest possibility, that on the other side of the mountain he would see the great river of the West flowing toward the setting sun. He had come to the far end of America, and he was ready for his reward. And what did he see? Immense ranges of mountains still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered with snow in August. He must have felt as if his stomach had suddenly imploded. Where he had hoped against hope to see his dream come true, Jefferson's dream, Christopher Columbus's dream, the dream of a Northwest Passage, he saw range after range of purple mountain majesties receding to the west, receding beyond vision. It was the best and the worst of times. He was looking at the Idaho batholith, at the Bitterroot and Salmon River Mountains, at the Lemhi Range and the Lost River Range, and maybe all the way to the Yellow Jacket Mountains and the Bighorn Crags of the Salmon River Breaks. He was looking at what the folks in Idaho still call the Great Barrier Reef, which makes it absolutely impossible to get from northern and to southern Idaho on any modern mode of transportation. And Meriwether Lewis was not enthralled by the magnificent beauty of this scenic view. One thought, and one thought only, had to be running through his mind. How the hell are we going to get through that? He wasn't. Now, Lewis soon caught up with the long-pursued Shoshone Indians. But Kamehameha, their leader, quickly hit him with a 1-2 punch. Unwelcome information about the impassability of the Salmon River and the reluctance of the natives to return with him to the Beaverhead and help transport his baggage across the divide. The Shoshone feared him in league with the Pockies, luring them into an ambuscade where their enemies were waiting. Well, over the next 2 weeks, Meriwether Lewis more than earned his pay as commander of the voyage of discovery. Alternately threatening and cajoling the Shoshone, he persuaded them against their better judgment to accompany him back to Camp Fortunate to await Clark and the boats. He was gloomy, he was cheerful. He showed faith in the Indians by handing Kamehameha his gun, and he put them down by remarking on the caprice of a few savages who are ever as fickle as the wind. He told lies, he promised help, and in the end, he won. Crossing the Continental Divide with Shoshone help and horses represented a crowning personal triumph for Lewis. It was his finest hour. How strange, then, the autobiographical flogging he gave himself on his 31st birthday, August 18th, 1805. I had as yet done but little, very little indeed, he wrote, to further the happiness of the human race or to advance the information of the succeeding generation. And I viewed with regret the many hours I have spent in indolence. It'll take a much better psychoanalyst than I am to plumb the depths of this man's character. Now, even more serious for students of the expedition is Lewis's decision after August 26th to stop writing his journal. This decision has always puzzled scholars. Some believe that Lewis did in fact keep a journal, or at least field notes, between September and December 1805, but that they have been lost. Others assert that he suffered a mental breakdown, triggered perhaps by news from Clark that the Northwest Passage ran down the river of no return. Now, Lewis must have been thoroughly wrung out by the Shoshone negotiations, which had almost broken off just the day before, and surely he suffered from strain and exhaustion. But he had recovered sufficiently just a few days and a week later when he busied himself collecting seeds and flowers in the Rocky Mountains and accumulating a flathead vocabulary at Ross's Hole. Still, he did not resume writing his journal. Now, Gary Moulton has warned us never to assume that a missing journal once existed if there is no hard evidence of it. And for Lewis, there is no such hard evidence. Some circumstantial evidence, but no hard evidence, and we may presume that something had snapped. Perhaps Lewis did suffer momentarily, temporarily, from what Thomas Jefferson would later call sensible depressions of mind. Meanwhile, William Clark was taking charge of the expedition and putting it turned out, at considerable risk. Maybe Meriwether Lewis didn't believe his visual senses on the top of the mountain, or maybe he didn't believe Kamehameha, or maybe he was just being, as was his wont, depressingly thorough. On August 18th, Lewis had sent Clark and 11 axemen ahead across the pass and down the Lemhi and Salmon rivers to confirm the bad news. In 6 days, Clark traveled 20 miles down the river of no return, becoming perfectly satisfied as to the impracticability of this route, either by land or water. He took with him the Shoshone guide Toby, who, along with the Hidatsa chief who mapped the West for Lewis and Clark, and Sakakawea herself, stands as the single Native American most important to the success of the expedition. And we know him only as Old Toby. Once persuaded of the impossibility of the river route, Clark rolled the dice on the expedition's greatest gamble. On his own, and against the advice of the rest of the Shoshone Indians, Clark hired Toby to guide the expedition all the way to the Clearwater River. It was a bold and audacious move, uncertain, potentially dangerous. Clark entrusted the fate of the entire expedition totally in the hands of one old Indian who really wasn't sure about how to cross the Bitterroots into Montana, and who alone of his people knew of the Nez Perce Trail across Lolo Pass. With this decision went the certain knowledge that the Rocky Mountains weren't the Blue Ridge Range in Virginia, and that it wasn't just a half-day's portage to another river. The Lewis and Clark expedition was in for a long, often arduous, overland trek by foot and horse across the Rocky Mountains. As Lewis himself put it later, thus situated, we attempted with success those unknown, formidable, snow-clad mountains on the bare word of a savage, while 99 1/100ths of his countrymen assured us that such a passage was impracticable. Lewis also noted at the time, and condescendingly, that I felt perfectly satisfied that if the Indians could pass these mountains with their women and children, that we could also pass them. Of course, the Nez Perce Indians, when they crossed the Lolo Trail with their women and children, weren't stupid enough to do it with 2 feet of snow on the ground. What's more, they usually brought enough food along to sustain them on the crossing. Now, yesterday, William Lang suggested that Lewis and Clark couldn't find adequate words to describe the Columbia River, which was dark, damp, dank, and unlike any previous expedition experience. Well, I'll pick a fight. I suggest that the most out-of-mind experience endured by the expedition was not on the Columbia River, but in the Rockies. After all, the Columbia is just another river. And the explorers had already traversed the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Missouri rivers. The Columbia simply added a few variations on a common theme. But the Rockies, now there was a new experience, something neither Lewis nor Clark nor any Eastern American was at all prepared for. This place was clearly un-American, the most unusual, unique, and challenging environmental and ecological area anywhere on the trail. Rough, high hills, deep gullies. The stone lay one on another, and holes so that the horses could scarcely get along without breaking their legs. Huge rugged hills, a mountain nearly as steep as the roof of a house. Rocky hillsides where our horses were in perpetual danger of slipping to their certain destruction, and up and down steep hills where several horses fell, some turned over, and others slipped down steep hillsides. One horse crippled, and 2 gave out. Very rough and rocky. The mountains make close on each side of the creek, and high, covered with pine. This is a very lonesome place. Rough, rocky mountains all day. Some places so steep and rocky that some of the horses fell backwards and rolled to the bottom. Warts full of balsam. This is a very lonesome place. For differentness, I'll put the Rockies up against the Columbia anytime. Any takers? To top it all off, Toby got lost. Lost Trail Pass, 100 miles south of here, is named for old Toby, the expedition's reliable guide. Maybe there was a direct Shoshone trail running north across the pass to Camp Creek and Ross's Hole. And maybe there wasn't. For Toby, there wasn't. Pilot lost his way, Clark noted ruefully. Toby might have led the party up Dahlonega Creek on the Gibbonsville Road to the Big Hole, then over Gibbons Pass to Ross's Hole, a longer but far easier route along well-worn trails. Instead, he struck out over the mountaintops on a September 3rd route that still mystifies scholars. He probably did not come down Wall Creek, as Olin Wheeler and most trail fetishists insist, but on the West Fork of Camp Creek, and thence to Charlie Russell's famous meeting with the Flatheads at Ross's Hole. Now, the Flathead, or Salish Indians, 300 to 400 strong, were the second major Rocky Mountain tribe encountered by the expedition, and they got the shortest shrift. The explorers spent barely 48 hours with the Flatheads, and their journal comments are brief to the point of being cryptic. It is here that we really miss Meriwether Lewis's journal, for it is inconceivable that the captain would have let the Flatheads slip by with so little ink. Indeed, Lewis violated Thomas Jefferson's specific ethnographic instructions, pointed out to us yesterday by Robert Carricker and commented on this morning, by not recording these data himself or instructing others to do so. Captain Lewis is thus guilty of gross incompetence, dereliction of duty and failure to follow direct orders from the President. I have to think that one reason, sort of a callous reason, that Lewis and Clark all but bypassed the Salish is that they didn't need them. Oh, they traded in some horses and they bought a few others. But they knew where they were going, and they already had a guide, and they really didn't need the Salish for any help or assistance on the expedition. And there is no follow-up commentary, as again was noted this morning, no follow-up commentary on the startling revelation found only in the journals of Private Joseph Whitehouse and Sergeant John Ordway, and not in Clark's more official compilation from Whitehouse. They tell us that we can go in 6 days to where white traders come, and that they have seen bearded men who came to a river to the north of us 6 days' march, but we have 4 mountains to cross before we come on that river. Now, this important geopolitical information, which refers to 2 employees of David Thompson's Northwest Company on the upper Kootenai River in southern British Columbia, ought to have been of intense interest to the captains and their superiors, but we hear no more about it. Ironically, we know more about this meeting at Sula from Salish accounts given later than we do from the explorers' own records. We learn, for example, that William Clark spent the night of September 5th in a lodge with an Indian of the opposite sex, and that some 9 months later, the product of that union appeared. Can we trust this Native American information? Let me say that I treat it with as much skepticism as I treat the journals of Lewis and Clark. As Bill Lang pointed out, these journals must be read very carefully, and they are just as important for what they do not tell us as for what they do. They are journals of military officers writing to their commander-in-chief, and they are not going to reveal the derelictions of duty that may have occurred. And there are lots of other sections in the journals where I think the captains are very carefully excluding an awful lot of relevant information and not telling us what actually happened. We get that information from supporting sources. From Ross's Hole, the expedition pushed on down the Bitterroot River to Traveler's Rest, where on September 9th, Old Toby casually dropped the single most important piece of geographical information found anywhere in the entire corpus of the journals of Lewis and Clark. Our guide could not inform us where this river, the Bitterroot, discharged itself into the Columbia. He informed us that it continues its course along the mountains to the north as far as he knew it, and that not very distant from where we were then, it formed a junction with a stream nearly as large as itself, the Clark Fork at Missoula, which took its rise in the mountains near the Missouri to the east of us and passed through an extensive valley, generally open prairie, the Deer Lodge Valley, I think, which forms an excellent pass to the Missouri. The point of the Missouri where this Indian Pass intersects it is about 30 miles above the gates of the Rocky Mountain. The guide informed us that a man might pass to the Missouri from hence by that route in 4 days. 4 days. Now, scholars disagree on whether Toby referred to a road to Three Forks or one up the Blackfoot River to Great Falls, but the distance is the same, about 170 miles. It's a stiff 4-day ride, but the distance is about the same. Now, 4 days and 170 miles beats 8 weeks and 700 miles, which is the time and the distance it took for Lewis and Clark to get from the Great Falls to Travelers Rest. That sound you hear is the scales falling from the eyes of Lewis and Clark. Right then and there, I believe Lewis and Clark decided that if they ever got back this way, they'd split up and try that route. Now, one last dangerous leg of the Rocky Mountain journey remained. The 2-week trip over the Lolo Trail, once Toby found it, to the Weippe Prairie and the Nez Perce encampment. Though every man was sicker than a dog, fortunately the Nez Perce were peaceful, the expedition's long, outbound Rocky Mountain sojourn was over. It had lasted technically from water to water, from getting out of the Beaverhead River at the old town of Armstead, Montana, to re-entering the water at the Clearwater River. But in order to understand what they were doing at Armstead in the first place, we have to go back to the Great Falls, to Old Toby's Road, and to the passage that Lewis would later describe to Thomas Jefferson. A trip, a long, circuitous loop from the Great Falls south, across the divide, back north, and they ended up at a point about 170 miles from where they had started. What do we make of all this? Well, first, the Rocky Mountain Loop derailed the expedition's optimistic timetable for travel to the Pacific and back. Ever since Fort Mandan, and as late as the Shoshone Gathering, Lewis and Clark anticipated reaching the Pacific and returning to the Shoshone, to a point east of the divide, to Fort Mandan, in calendar year 1805. If it had maintained its pace from the Mandans to the Falls, an astonishing 16 miles per day upriver, and if it had figured out the overland route from the Falls to Travelers Rest, and if the Shoshone had been there to sell them a few horses, a lot of ifs, the expedition might have reached the ocean in September. Instead, the long Rocky Mountain Loop put it in the cold and snow of the Bitterroot Mountains in September and ultimately forced the dreary Clatsop winter. I don't envy Lewis and Clark for spending 4 months in northeastern Oregon, where even today the suicide rate rises in the wintertime. Second, the 8-week detour around a 4-day saunter put the expedition several times at risk. Most of the time it was lost. It rapidly ran out of both water and time. It rested its fortunes in the hands of an aging Indian who didn't always know where he was going, but he got him there in the end. It came as close as it ever did to perishing on the Lolo Trail. It somehow deprived Meriwether Lewis of his need to keep a journal. Third, summertime in the Rockies, combined with Lewis and Clark's separate ventures on the return trip the following year, added immeasurably to the storehouse of geographical knowledge about the huge white space on the maps of Northwest America. Fourth, the expedition contacted and consulted with 2 new Indian societies, the Shoshone and the Salish. Fifth, the Rocky Mountains offered an imaginative new meaning to the old notion of a Northwest Passage. When Meriwether Lewis got home, he wrote Thomas Jefferson that we have discovered the most practicable route which does exist across the continent by means of the navigable branches of the Missouri and Columbia rivers. He then described a passage by land of 340 miles from the Missouri to the Kuskookee, the Clearwater. It was the most formidable part of the tract. Of this distance, 200 miles is along a good road, that'd be from Great Falls to Travelers Rest, and 140 over tremendous mountains, which for 60 miles are covered with eternal snows, from Travelers Rest to the Clearwater. How's that again? A practicable route by navigable branches, and it consists of a 340-mile road over tremendous mountains, part of which are covered with eternal snows. This is an intellectual act of faith. Somehow I don't think Lewis was connecting the two sides of his brain. Poor Meriwether. He envisioned a chain of trading posts along his passage, busily exchanging furs for the products of China. How spectacularly wrong. American trappers and traders who came up the Missouri in the wake of Lewis and Clark rarely crossed the Rockies. Instead, they went back down the river to St. Louis in the east. Not a single fur trader in the records of history crossed the Lolo Trail in the whole first half of the 19th century. Nor did the American presence established by the expedition undermine British fur supremacy, as Jefferson and Lewis both hoped. The British remained in command of the Blackfeet trade until the 1830s, and west of the Divide until the 1840s. Nor did the upper Missouri become, as Lewis prophesied, the shortest and fastest route to the Pacific. A succeeding generation headed up the Platte River and over South Pass on the wagon trail to Oregon. Lewis could not even imagine what first brought settlers in numbers to the northern Rockies. Not furs, not East Indian commodities, not trade, but gold. But we must not lament that a good deal of the Rocky Mountain circuitous high produced less than edifying results. After all, if the Rockies hadn't been there, Lewis and Clark wouldn't have come here, and neither would we. Thanks very much. Now, this is your last chance to learn the truth. And I'll even put on my glasses so I can see if anyone has any. If I put them on, I can't read. If I leave them off, I can't see. So, yes?
I think there's been a lot of concern about different ways of looking at history to come out of this conference that may not have been, apparent to a lot of people who were going to come. One of the problems in that, in my way of thinking, is that we don't have public access to the other side of the story as far as these oral tradition records and so forth. So, not commenting on your speech, but I would love to have your comments on an overview of the conference. As far as those of us who are interested in the historical process and research, how can we make judgments that are based more on perspectives about whose icon is,
Well, I would, none of the provocative assertions that I have heard at this conference are entirely false, but none of them are the entire truth as well. And we need to put all of these developments into a total perspective. I think basically that the bigger perspective we get on the Lewis and Clark expedition, the less important the expedition itself becomes. I mean, what happened after Lewis and Clark, namely the arrival of American and British capitalism in the way of the fur trade, had a far more important impact on the West than simply their travel, and certainly on the Native American societies that Lewis and Clark found here. And I think that a generation or even two, maybe longer, before Lewis and Clark, Native Americans had already been impacted by the most deadly European arrival, namely disease. smallpox and other diseases ravaged the northern plains at least as early as the 1760s, and probably earlier. And so the Blackfeet, the Flathead, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce communities that Lewis visited had already been severely impacted, not to mention the Arikara and the Mandan. And I'll say as well that we have been working on the documentation of Lewis and Clark now for at least 100 years, ever since Elliott Cowes rediscovered the journals. We've been working on making other kinds of testimony and records available for less than a fourth of that time. So I think by the tercentenary of the expedition, a lot of other records will be available and scrutinized. And the American historical profession has discovered Native American history in the last 25 years. We whitewashed history, literally, for most of our existence. Anything else that?
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, sir.
You stated that Lewis and Clark expected to meet the Shoshone Indians at Great Falls. Now, I've read quite a few different books on Lewis and Clark, and I do not know where that information comes from. Can you tell me the name of the book that I can acquire and read myself?
I'm looking at some standard histories of the Blackfeet and of the Shoshones by John Ewers and I forgot the name of the guy who wrote on the Shoshones. I'm also looking at some of the information that Lewis and Clark received about Northern Plains tribes from the Hidatsa Indians during their winter at Fort Mandan. And their information indicated that the Shoshone Indians lived east of the divide between the Great Falls and the Three Forks. That's what they believed. They discovered an abandoned encampment just south of the falls on their trip. They believed it was a Shoshone encampment. Now, I believe that information is correct. I believe, however, that it is a little outdated. That's the problem. I believe that in a very short period of time, the Blackfeet Indians, who were the first Northern Plains tribe to acquire guns, acquiring them overland from British and French traders, in a very short period of time, the Blackfeet had used their newly acquired weapons to drive the Shoshone and the Flatheads off of the plains and into the mountains where Lewis and Clark ultimately found them. Now, even 5 years earlier, I think the information would have been more correct and less outdated than it was. So that's my speculation. History is all speculation and opinion. If we can find a few facts to back it up, why, all the better. Anything else?
How do you account for the tremendous mythology evidently that arises from Sakakawea?
I go with, I forgot the scholar who first pointed it out, that Sakakawea was invented by the feminist movement in the early 20th century. When it was simply looking for Native American female heroes heroines to plug into the story. And I think I've heard, I don't know if this is true, that there are more statues to Sakakawea in the United States than of any other American woman. And I think in that process, which was done as much by romance novelists like Eva Dye and others, that the actual contributions of Sakakawea to the expedition, while substantial, were romanticized a bit out of proportion. And I stand with James Rhonda, who argues that today Sakakawea stands as a symbol of all of the Native Americans, less well known and unnamed, who provided assistance to the explorers on their way west.
There's an article on that subject in the last issue of the Pacific Northwest Quarterly.
Okay. Do I have to read that? Okay. You have to read it. Well, folks, if there are no other questions, I'll be happy to hang around if anybody wants to ask one that won't embarrass them. If not, I want to thank you all for coming to this conference.